Yeah, thanks for having me. My name is Robert. I'm the CTO of alcemy, and I'm going to tell you about the lessons we learned from actually deploying machine learning in cement and concrete. So basically, my talk consists of three parts. So the first, I'm going to talk about the big or massive problem that cement and concrete has. Then I'm going to introduce the solution that we came up with and what machine learning has to do with this. And then finally, we come to the actual lessons that we learned from deploying our machine learning solution in the wild. So let's start with the problem. So concrete is the most used building material across the planet. In fact, the only thing that mankind consumes more of by volume is water. And it's just getting bigger because it's expected that by 2060, the world's building stock will have doubled. That means from now until then, every month we will rebuild New York City. That's good on one hand, because that means there's more housing for an ever-growing population and there's infrastructure for the developing world, but this comes with a very heavy price tag. And the big problem I'm talking about is the massive carbon footprint of concrete. It's 8% of worldwide emissions. So if concrete was a country, it would be the third largest emitter, right after China and the US. And to understand where this carbon footprint is coming from, let's look at how concrete is made. So it all starts with a quarry, with a limestone quarry to be precise. And that's great because limestone is available all around the earth, meaning it's available in these huge quantities that are needed to build the world. So then this limestone is transported into a cement plant where it's refined into cement, which is the most important ingredient for concrete. Then later on in the concrete batching plant, to the cement, we add water, sand, and gravel. And then we have ready-mixed concrete, which is transported to the construction site to build bridges, houses, you name it. And the carbon footprint of this material is basically due to one step, and that's the cement plant. And to be more precise, it's one particular step of the cement production that is almost exclusively responsible for this massive carbon footprint, and that is the cement kiln or the rotating kiln. It's where the limestone from the quarry is taken, burned, and turned into clinker. Clinker is the stuff that makes the concrete hard. Problem is, if I burn limestone, what happens is that the CO2 in the limestone actually gets released into the atmosphere. And the important part here is it's inherent to the process. So we can't mitigate the carbon footprint simply by using renewable energy. So how can we then reduce the carbon footprint? To get a better idea, let's again look back at the main ingredients of concrete. So it's water, some admixtures like plasticizers, sand, aggregates, and the most important one, the cement. Remember, cement is the one that has the heavy carbon footprint. If we look more closely at the cement, actually cement is made out of just, basically speaking, two things. So one is the clinker. That's the stuff coming out of the kiln. That's the one that's really heavy CO2 footprint. And the other stuff is basically filler materials, so-called supplementary cementitious materials. Some of them have their own carbon footprint, like fly ash or slag, which are byproducts of steel and coal production. But others, like fine limestone, or also called limestone flour, are basically carbon-free. So limestone flour is just limestone that has been ground very, very finely without burning, so no CO2 emitted. So basically, the whole carbon footprint of concrete is due to this clinker component. So a way to mitigate or to reduce the carbon footprint of the building material is simply to reduce the amount of clinker in the entire mix. And that's actually what we want to do. So if this is regular concrete with regular cement with lots of clinker, we can get to low carbon concrete using low carbon cement, which just has a tiny or a short amount of clinker in it. And with this simple step, we can actually reduce the carbon footprint of concrete on average by 60%. And that's not just a pipe dream, because we've actually done it. So we created this low carbon concrete, made loads of tests in laboratories to see if it's still a feasible material. And we even moved out of laboratories into a real construction site. So not long ago, in August, we actually poured our first concrete pour, like in a real construction site. It's a foundation of a garage, to show that this low carbon concrete actually works in reality. So that's great news. Low carbon concrete exists. It works. You might question now, okay, what does machine learning have to do with this? Why do you need an IT company and machine learning to produce that? Okay, so as I said, in order to reduce the carbon footprint, we want to reduce clinker. The challenge here is that clinker actually makes concrete robust. That means if we reduce the clinker, we get less robust concrete. So any problems or intricacies that are already happening in the cement are then amplified by our low carbon concrete. And the most important property of cement is its compressive strength. That's what's making the buildings upright. So if we have quite some fluctuations over time in this compressive strength, these fluctuations get amplified if we use low carbon concrete recipes. So one of the big prerequisites for low carbon concrete to be produced at scale is that we have a reliable and trustworthy cement strength. And that's actually hard to achieve because measuring cement strength takes 28 days. The way you do this is you form actually a concrete cube with cement, a standardized amount of water and a standardized amount of sand, and then you have to let it sit for 28 days and harden, and then you crush it like this after almost a month to figure out how much compressive strength it can withstand. Sorry. Here's now where machine learning gets into the mix. So we will use machine learning to get, or we do use machine learning to get the cement strength on point. So what we do is we actually predict the cement strength that would develop 28 days later, right at the time of production, so we can immediately counteract if something's going wrong. So here's the principle. So first of all, where do these fluctuations in the compressive strength stem from? Well, cement is made out of a natural material, and that is limestone. And limestone might vary from cubic meter to cubic meter, even within the same quarry. So the chemical composition and mineralogy can actually change. And these changes in the composition of the limestone then yield changes and fluctuations in the compressive strength. So what we want to do is basically just counteract these compressive strength changes by adjusting the fineness of the material, because the fineness of cement is a good lever to influence the compressive strength. The more fine I grind my cement, the more surface area it has to react with water, the stronger it gets. So meaning if due to natural fluctuation, the cement gets stronger, we can actually grind more coarsely. And if it's getting not strong enough, we can grind more finer. And with that, we then can achieve a material that has a very reliable and homogeneous and consistent strength over time. So here's how our application actually integrates into a cement plant. What you see here is a depiction of the last step of the cement production, the cement mill. So we are now right after the kiln. Remember, kiln produces clinker, heavy CO2 footprint, but here are the other supplementary cementitious materials like fly ash, slag, and the carbon-free fine limestone. So these get mixed together according to your cement recipe, chucked into the cement mill to actually grind them very, very finely. And then there's this filter or separator step that can separate fine particles from coarse ones. So the fine ones are finished cement, the coarse ones have to take extra turns through the cement mill. And by influencing the separator and some settings of the cement mill, we can actually influence the fineness of the material. But it doesn't stop there. So in a cement plant, there are regularly cement samples taken right after the cement mill. And these are automatically analyzed with X-ray fluorescence, X-ray diffractomy, and a particle size analyzer. So this gives us a characterization of the cement samples in terms of its chemical composition, crystal structure, and the actual distribution of particles. And this data then is exported into our cloud AI system, where we then run machine learning on top of it to really predict the compressive strength that would have developed or will develop 28 days later. And now we can react immediately and don't have to wait a month to figure out how strong our stuff is going to get. So for instance, if then we predict that the cement is getting too strong, we can grind more coarsely. If we're predicting it's getting not strong enough, we can grind more fine. Actually, what we do is simply compute optimal set points for the cement mills in order to achieve this. And then these set points are fed back into the plant. The cement mill is adjusted either by the operator or directly by the expert system in place. And then when we draw a sample 2 or 3 hours later, we will see, okay, we have reacted to the changes and now the cement strength is really on point again. And here's how that actually looks like how the results actually look like that we achieved in the plant. So what you can see here are strength tests of a cement plant over about 5 years. And every blue dot here corresponds to one particular strength test where they actually formed such a cube that I just showed in the video, let it sit and harden for 28 days and then crush it. And as you can see in this rolling median function here, that basically the fluctuations are quite substantial over time. So the fluctuations in the cement strength go from like 50 to 65 megapascals, and that's actually quite a lot. And now from here on, as you can see, we applied our solution into the plant, and we were able to reduce these fluctuations by about 30%, which then for an average cement plant amounts to savings of around 300 to €500,000. And it's a mixture of savings in energy, savings in CO2 certificates, and actually higher profit margins due to better quality. So basically, this is the whole control loop and the machine learning service that we provide for cement plants. And we've deployed this now in 4 plants. Plants 5 and 6 are soon to be coming. But actually getting there and having the whole system running was quite a bumpy ride. And we had some learnings on the way that I want to share with you now. So learning number 1, or lesson number 1, is do not spend too much time on complex models. I mean, we tried many different machine learning models, and so because it's fun, I mean, we tried PyTorch neural networks. I mean, deep learning is fun. You can play around with the network architecture. You can play around with the learning rate, even the learning algorithm itself, test dropout, you name it. Lots of stuff to try out. Of course, we tried support vector machines, Gaussian processes, XGBoost, you name it, we tried it. Unfortunately, all of these gave basically no improvements. Even worse, they are quite black boxy models. So what we really ended up with in production is a combination of regularized linear regression and a random forest for the nonlinearities. And it's actually great because just looking at the coefficients of the linear regression, you can really understand what the model learned from the data. And that's actually important because we deploy our models in order to really control cement live. Meaning we have to be confident that the models not only picked up some spurious correlations between the features and the cement strength, but actually learned causal relations that are also known to cement engineers. So for instance, of course, it needs to learn that fineness is a good lever to change strength, because that's the one we're optimizing with. But if stuff pops out that has been used or has been known by cement engineers for a while, like titanium dioxide reduces strength or calcium silicate increases strength, that's great because it really gives us the confidence that the model learned something meaningful. But we learned what is more important than the model itself is actually proper pre-processing. So you should do outlier filtering. Make sure to remove extreme values, because usually extreme values mean it's a measurement error. But do not remove too extreme values, because they might actually teach your machine learning a valuable lesson. To figure out what's a good threshold, when to remove what, that's a good place for a hyperparameter optimization. And also, it's important to do proper scaling. Our variables live on very different scales, so normalization is key. We used a robust scaler to do that, but we had to learn that the default settings of the robust scaler are not that robust. The default settings are scaling between a 25th and a 75th percentile. Problem is, if you have a data dimension that has, in the majority of the data, almost no variation, but lots of stuff is going on in the extreme ranges, using the default robust scaler would really blow up that dimension. So if you scale between the 5th and the 95th percentile, you actually get, to our mind, a more robust scaler. And from now on, we will use that as a default setting. Then, of course, we need to do imputation, meaning because we have problems with many missing values from experiments and from the measurement devices. But proper imputation also means just throw away data that has too many missing values. Because if you try to impute these, you will end up with heavy bias in your final machine learning pipeline. But this is already a nice step where you can already use machine learning to impute some columns, because our columns are highly collinear, so we might be able to predict column A from column B and C. However, still do simple imputation like a group median for columns that have many missing features, because if you would again use machine learning here, you would introduce bias into your model. When to do which of the three and defining thresholds, again, a good place for a hyperparameter optimization. Okay, so now we have our model in place, and we are soon to deploy the model to actually run stuff in a cement plant and optimize cement manufacturing. So, of course, before we deploy our model, we really want to know and get a good estimate of how well the model is going to behave in this real-life setting. So realistic model evaluation is key. In order to estimate the model performance in the real life, what we can always do is cross-validation. The problem is the assumption of cross-validation, of random regular cross-validation, is that your data is independent. In a real-life setting, especially in the process industry like cement, that is not the case. We have a constant stream of material where we eventually take samples, so our data is highly, highly correlated in time. I mean, you can see that here. If I draw a high-strength sample today, then it's quite likely that tomorrow I will also draw a high strength sample. So data is really highly correlated, and the ordering of data and when it was taken really matters. So we cannot do random cross-validation because that would yield huge data leakage. So what we do have to do instead is temporal cross-validation, meaning we order our data according to the time dimension, and then we train on a consecutive interval followed by another consecutive interval, which we then use for validation. But even that wouldn't be enough for us, because remember, the arrival of the true labels, the actual cement strength, takes 28 days, because I have to form a concrete cube, let it harden for 28 days, and then crush it. And this we had to bake into the cross-validation, meaning we had to skip data for 28 days before we actually start the validation flow to really make our cross-validation resemble what's going on in real life in real cement plants. And if we wouldn't do that and just use regular random cross-validation, we would actually overestimate model performance by 30% and more. And there's nothing more embarrassing for a machine learning engineer than figuring out later that your model deployed in production is much, much worse from what you estimated from your training data. Okay, so now we can use temporal cross-validation to measure realistic KPIs like mean squared error, root mean squared error, mean absolute error, you name it. So for instance, here you see the simulation, like one temporal cross-validation of one particular model over 1 year, prediction in red and true labels in blue. The mean absolute error here is 1.4 megapascals. So then this leaves you, is that good? Is that bad? What does 1.4 megapascals in error actually mean? So we need a way to really figure out how our model behaves and compare it to something meaningful. And what you can always do is compare, for instance, measures like the mean squared error to the target variance, like the variance in the actual target you're predicting. And that's an analog to R squared. So it basically tells you how much of the variance in my target is actually explained by my machine learning model. However, that's a bit difficult of a measure because the variance of the data we are looking at really depends on the selected time frame. So for instance, if I actually compare or evaluate my model only over a short amount of time, like this down here, I only observe a small variance in the target variable because our data is highly correlated. Also, if I choose a larger window, I might get a larger variance in the actual target variable. And in fact, because we have a non-stationary process, it doesn't converge for infinite time windows. Also, we don't have infinite time windows. So if you evaluate models over a particular time frame, you have to be aware that I can't compare model performances if I normalize it by the target variance over different time frames. So if I choose 1 year, I have to stick with 1 year, and it doesn't make sense to compare it with evaluations of half a year or even shorter timescales. But in order to get rid of this assumption or this problem of choosing a time frame, what you can always do is compare your model performance to simple baselines. So you should always use simple baselines. And a first natural choice of simple baseline is always a linear model. Still, our linear model has quite some assumptions because we still need to do pre-processing for the linear models. So that means we need to bake in assumptions for scaling, imputation, and of course, make a choice of features. And here's one advantage. When you have highly correlated data in time, there's a very easy way to come up with a very simple baseline that has basically no assumptions baked in, and that's just using a rolling median or a rolling mean over a certain time frame or the last X samples. And then you have a baseline that has no assumptions apart from just the window size or the number of samples. And if your machine learning even can't beat this rolling median, it's probably not worth applying machine learning to it. So that's a very, very nice baseline for settings like these. So this was already a lot of machine learning, but we quickly figured out that machine learning is only the tip of the iceberg. So this is our machine learning code, and this is all the rest. And I mean, I took this from Hidden Technical Depth in Machine Learning, which is a great paper. And I think this picture popped up during PyData always quite a lot, but it's so true, right? So for us, about two full-time employees worked about 2 months on the machine learning code, and now there's 7 heads and counting, working 3 years and counting on all the rest. I mean, for instance, there's lots of configuration for us. We have many different machine learning models per customer. We have different machine learning models per compressive strength for different groupings of cements, and all of this somehow needs to be managed. And then, of course, there's lots of work going into the serving infrastructure. I mean, our models are Dockerized and then served on AWS Fargate or Kubernetes, and that needs to be built and maintained. And of course, there's loads of monitoring, like monitoring if just the application runs, if the machine learning models are running, if they are any good, if data is coming in, if the data is any good, and so on and so forth. And here a big thank you to our machine learning lead, Nico, who actually replicated that image from our code base in GitLab. And you can see it actually fits quite well. So up here is the model code, including, by the way, the feature transformations and feature extractions. And here is all the rest. Yeah, so way more than the actual machine learning model. Okay, so I told you that there's lots of monitoring, and we do need lots of monitoring because it turns out running machine learning on customer provided data is really hard because customer data can change. So for instance, there might be changes in the data format. I mean, this happens. Why not change a date, right? From European to American, or that's my favorite, using full stop and comma as decimal separators almost unpredictably. I mean, one is the English notation for decimals, the other one is the German one. Why not mix both for fun? But there might actually be changes to the data itself. So there might be humans in the loop that are prettifying the data, meaning, I mean, some of the experiments, like the compressive strength experiment, where you actually have to crush the cube, are quite manual. And sometimes humans tend to, if they get a measure that is not in their favor, slightly correct the number. To make it look prettier. Problem is, if you do that, this will really confuse machine learning. So here's like lots of advocating and teaching involved that that processes like these really have to stop once you start deploying machine learning. And what regularly happens is that there's a recalibrations of the devices that provide the data for us, like the X-ray diffractomy or X-ray fluorescence. I mean, cement is a very fine powder, so stuff gets dirty pretty quickly or gets clogged. So you need to replace parts and then recalibrate devices. And this then can cause huge data and concept drifts, and we need to detect these and actually react upon that. And then there might actually be problems with the sample size, so where the samples are drawn itself. So as I told you, there are samples drawn right after the cement mills. These are the ones that we use to make the predictions and actually steer the cement mill grinding. However, there are also samples taken at the delivery silo when the cement, before the cement gets shipped to the concrete customers. And these are usually the ones that have compressive strength tests attached to it. So these are the ones that have the true labels that we can use for training. And these ones are used for prediction or inference. And it could be that due to the physical properties of this sample site and that sample site, they might be not completely representative, and there might be slight shift, for instance, in the particle size distribution. So we have to know about this and then bake that into our models. So there's lots of stuff that can actually go wrong with data. So for that, we actually introduced like very sophisticated data science processes whenever we onboard customer and once after we have onboarded them. So for every new customer, what we do is what we call a data deep dive. So that's, they send us historic data of 3 to 4 years, and we really go through each and every measurement of each and every cement one by one and look at idiosyncrasies and problems and whether the data makes sense. And if we spot something that looks out of the ordinary, we go back to the customer and together try to figure out what went wrong in the plant or what happened in the plant at that point in time that could explain the shifts in the data. And then when we decided, okay, the data looks feasible for machine learning and it makes sense to actually apply it, then we can start integrating into the systems of our customers. And our customers are cement plants and they are not IT companies, meaning they have quite some legacy systems in place, and integrating into legacy systems is quite some work. So usually that takes about half a year. So, and then once we finally have a customer in production, it doesn't stop there, of course. So we need to do continuous monitoring of customers' data. So if there's data drifts or shifts occurring, or if something changes, other changes. And then, of course, we need to do continuous evaluation of all our machine learning models. And I'm not kidding, we have with each and every customer weekly meetings where we discuss machine learning and data issues and changes in the plant. Because as I told you, if they recalibrate a device, or if they build a new mill, or if they change a silo setting, we need to know about this. So, and this then brings me basically to my final lesson that we had to draw from this. So machine learning as a service is not necessarily or completely equivalent to software as a service. I mean, software as a service from a VC point of view is a great business opportunity, because usually you have high profit margins and your marginal costs are zero with increasing customer size. And that's unfortunately not so much the case for machine learning as a service. Because I would argue that there's no such thing as a minimum viable product in industrial machine learning. I mean, to really get like a basic machine learning pipeline in place that can steer cement, there's so much we already have to do. And that is integrating into our customers' plant to actually do data monitoring. This data is properly exported from there. We have to configure the machine learning. We, of course, have to train it and deploy it, and then run all the predictions and optimizations, and then have means in order to serve that back into the plant. So I would argue that in industrial machine learning, you don't start with a skateboard, but you actually always have to start with a bike or even a full-fledged motorcycle. And then the other thing is, because we have machine learning models per customer, our ML costs scale rather linearly with the number of customers, so no zero marginal costs. Also, not to mention all the machine learning engineers you have to pay in order to build and maintain that. So, and I told you there's loads of consulting and educating involved because our customers are, like, so to say, first-time users of machine learning. And so what you really need are key account managers that are skilled interacting with the customer. So they need to speak their language, they need to know about cement, but they also need to be knowledgeable about machine learning because there's many, many questions coming up. And of course, the number of key account managers also not scales sublinearly with the number of customers that you have. So with all this, we actually came to the conclusion that in order to turn this into a viable business, we have to hunt elephants, or hopefully whales, but for now elephants, meaning these are customers who are willing to pay about $100,000 a year, because otherwise it really don't make sense to put industrial machine learning into solution. Fortunately, cement customers are of that kind. But one challenge, of course, is nobody gives away this amount of money lightly. So negotiations and sale processes might take some time. So like half a year or longer. So you need to be in for the long haul. And that pretty much concludes my talk. Thank you very much for having me. Here are some key takeaways from my slides. I'm reachable on Slack afterwards and in Gather. So if you want to gather at the cozy fireplace, meet me up there. I think we still have some time left. So I'm also happy to take some questions here. Are there questions in the Q&A? Yes. Okay, let me see. How do you exactly blend linear regression in a random forest? We use a random forest correcting the errors of the linear model. Works super nicely. Okay, same question again. What software do you use to generate the visuals of the ML models? Dash, Plotly Dash. Plotly Dash is great. Could you elaborate more on there's no MVP in industrial ML? Yes. So the problem is, of course, that there is, I mean, loads of stuff that you, that you really need to implement. I mean, it's not that you can come up with a Jupyter notebook with just some historic data and show that to your customers and then say, hey, look, there's my machine learning model, because there's nothing actionable from that. So in order to really have actionable ML that changes something in the plant, you have to be fully integrated into the plant. So like this whole control loop needs to be closed, and that's quite a lot of work. Yeah. Did you manage to incorporate the knowledge of employees of your customers in order to improve your models? Yes. So our pre-processing pipeline is actually quite sophisticated. So it's not just scaling, imputation, and outlier filtering. There is, for instance, encoding of different situations in the plant. There are data transformations, like some ratios that actually make sense from and cement engineering, cement quality engineering perspective. Okay, I think I run out of time here, but thank you very much. And thanks for having me.